I'm Heath Lambert, and you're listening to a bonus episode of What Happened at First Baptist Church. This bonus episode is for ministry staff, pastors, leaders, and anyone else wanting to take a deeper look at the revitalization of First Baptist Church to learn something about the mistakes and the successes we made during the changes at our church. I want to tell you the story of what happened. But I want to do more than tell you a story. All over the world, all over the country, pastors are inheriting churches and ministries that grew up in the second half of the last century, that grew up under the boomer generation, and those ministries are declining and failing, and they need a re-injection of life. They need to be relevant again. They need a re-infusion of power, and that requires change. And that change is overwhelming. I hear from people all over the country who don't know where to start, who don't know what to do. If you are a pastor confronting the need to bring about change in your own congregation, I want to share with you some of the lessons that I have learned on our own journey of change here at First Baptist. I am not an expert. I promise you that there are not very many people who would put me on the short list of leaders who are competent to take a declining, traditional, legacy, Southern Baptist, downtown megachurch and put it on a trajectory of change and growth. Most people would not choose me for that task. But the Lord chooses foolish people, weak vessels, so that He gets glory for any good thing. I want to tell you some of the things that a weak and foolish vessel like myself has observed as I've seen what the Lord has done through all of my limitations and through the good things that He's accomplished in these last several years. I also want to talk to you if you're experiencing change. Every Christian in America right now is watching the world change around them. We like to go to our churches and feel like things are safe and secure in the way they used to be. And when a leader comes in and says, we have to change or die, we have to make transitions, the way we did things back in the day aren't the way we're going to be able to do things today. When that happens, that change is overwhelming. It's disorienting. Horrible and hard things happen in your congregation, and you are sitting there trying to figure out how in the world to make sense of this. I haven't just been responsible for leading change here at First Baptist. I've been participating in that change with dearly beloved Christian men and women who've needed help to think through all of the changes and all the challenges that they're facing. And you're going to hear from some of those people in our church who've learned lessons about the grace of God as they've seen that ministry change. Over the next few weeks, I'm going to tell you some of the First Baptist story. Each week, I'll advance the story a little bit and give you a little more color, a little more information about what happened here. I'm going to share with you lessons that you can apply in your own situation. Maybe your church is big, maybe it's small. Maybe you are the leader in charge of change at your church. Maybe you are a member at your church who is being led. Regardless of who you are or where you are or what your context is, I want us all to learn together about how change works, about what God is doing to create a new, fresh, and powerful demonstration of the gospel in our day. I hope we can grow up together to be more faithful Christians and to have more faithful churches. And if the Lord can use the hardest years of difficulty in my life to serve you and your congregation, then it will have been more than worth it. How did First Baptist become so large and influential? We're going to start this week talking about the rise of First Baptist Church. And as we talk about that rise to prominence and influence, we're going to learn some lessons about leadership. God never does a great work without a great leader. There is no exception to this in the Bible. When God does a great work, it's always attached to a great leader. The great works that the Lord has done in your church in the past at my church, and the great works that he will do in the present and in the future are going to be tied to a leader. There is no Exodus without a Moses, no kingdom expansion without David, no rebuilding of the wall without Nehemiah. There is no preparation for Jesus without John the Baptist, no preaching of the gospel to the Gentiles without Paul. It's the same in church history. Every single significant movement you can imagine in church history is tied to a great leader, whether Augustine or Luther or Wesley or Whitefield or Graham, whoever it is. The great movements in church history that you're aware of are tied to a great leader. Here's a very important question for you to answer. What kind of leader are you? That question might be harder to answer than you know. The story of the ministry you lead is one of leaders that God has raised up to do His work. And now, if you're the leader, you are part of that legacy. By the end of this, you will know some of the realities that made First Baptist Church so great, and you'll have some context to try to discern what kind of leader you are. So let me tell you about 6 different kinds of leaders that we find in the Bible and that are usable in your church's ministry. The first kind of leader I'm going to call a founder. Founder is somebody who is a special kind of person with a special kind of skill to do something that has never existed before. Think in the Bible of Abraham. All the way over in Ur of the Chaldees, there is no Jewish people yet, there is no land yet, and he loads up the camels, he packs up the trunks, and he moves across the known world to do something nobody could have even comprehended, nobody understood. Founders work very hard and do crazy things to accomplish work that others can't even imagine. They have miraculous levels of energy and resourcefulness. They are truly amazing leaders. Are you a founder? How do you know? You'll know if you're the kind of leader who is a founder, if you're a visionary that can see what others can't. If you're a worker that can go harder than most people can go. If you can sacrifice more than most people can sacrifice. The labor is hard, it is backbreaking, but it is very rewarding. If you are a founder, then sooner or later, as faithfulness leads to more faithfulness, everybody in the future of your ministry will look back and be able to thank God for His grace through you for starting that ministry. The founder of the ministry at First Baptist Church is James McDonald.
So here it comes, 4 things from 2 Kings 4, the way God works, the way God works. Ready?
Probably not the James McDonald that you are thinking of that is prominent in modern evangelicalism. The James McDonald that was the founder of First Baptist Church planted the church in 1838. Back then, Martin Van Buren was the 8th president of the United States. Jacksonville had only been a city for 6 years. Florida was still a territory and not yet a state. And the Southern Baptist Convention was still 7 years away from existence. She wanted there to be a Baptist church in Jacksonville. McDonald poured his soul into planting First Baptist Church. He got 6 original members together. They built a small little one-room meeting place, and it was a very modest and fruitful effort. The church grew and ultimately branched out. Other churches grew out of it, and they took various names, but the mother church, the founding church, kept the name of First Baptist. That's one kind of leader. Another kind of leader that we can talk about are what I call builders. Builders are people who expand an existing ministry. Think of David or think of Solomon. They take the kingdom of Israel to unprecedented heights. They think outside the box. They inspire others to be involved and follow them. I want to talk to you about 2 different kinds of builders from the history of First Baptist Church so you can get a clear picture about what a builder is and how First Baptist got to be First Baptist. The first builder is a man named W.A. Hobson. Dr. Hobson moved from Birmingham, Alabama to Jacksonville, Florida in 1900 to become the pastor of the church. He got here just in time for one of the largest fires in the history of the United States of America. It happened in 1901, just about a year after he got here. It's called the Great Fire of Jacksonville. It destroyed 146 blocks of Jacksonville. It leveled 2,368 buildings, and one of the buildings that it leveled was the chapel at First Baptist Church, which had just been built in 1893. The building, not even a decade old, was burned to the ground. And Hobson knew his job had changed. He took a leave of absence and he began to travel all over the country raising money. He worked hard for over a year, and by the time he'd raised money from the Southern Baptist Convention, from churches and other parts of the state, from donors throughout the city, and from faithful members at First Baptist Church, he had raised enough money to construct the building, and the building was completed on Valentine's Day, 1904, just a handful of years after the structure had been burnt to the ground. That structure that was erected in 1904 remains today, and we call it the Hobson Auditorium. It is a beautiful building that we still use over 120 years later. Hobson was a builder. As best we can tell from our history, he launched an explosion of church planting in Jacksonville, Florida, planting dozens of churches in Jacksonville, many of which still exist today. By the time he left First Baptist Church in the 1920s, it was a strong, growing, faithful church. Times were good and expansive, but those good times were not to last. That brings us to another kind of leader we need to talk about in a different season in the life of First Baptist: decliners. Decliners preside over seasons of decline in the life of a ministry. The ministry of a decliner is not equivalent to faithlessness. Decliners may be remarkably gifted leaders, but they're serving in challenging circumstances. Decline comes for all sorts of reasons. Just because a leader is leading during a period of decline, it doesn't mean that they are a bad leader. Think of the ministry of the prophet Isaiah, who is one of the most faithful preachers in the history of redemption. And at the beginning of his ministry, God says, you are going to preach and be faithful, and nobody will listen. There's all sorts of reasons why faithful men might be decliners, but regardless, the ministry decreases in size on their watch. One of the decliners in the history of First Baptist Church was a man who had a reputation as a remarkable preacher, but who lacked administrative giftedness. And that pastor's name was Lynn Broughton. He followed Dr. Hobson. He was known in the 1920s all over the world as what they called back then a pulpiteer. His sermons were published in newspapers across the country, but he struggled to manage the financial affairs of the church. He made unsustainable financial commitments, and by the 1940s, First Baptist Church was the most indebted church in America. In fact, at that moment, First Baptist didn't even own any of its buildings anymore because they had been mortgaged. So First Baptist was in a very serious season of weakness, and people were leaving the church in droves. Another kind of leader that we need to understand, I call a reformer. Reformers are transformational leaders. They come into a difficult situation, identify what needs to change, challenge people to grab the new vision, give new life and faithfulness to something that has gone stale. Think of the ministry of John the Baptist. God raises up a leader to prepare for the reform of the old covenant, and the new covenant is dawning in the person and work of Jesus Christ. One of the great reformers in the history of First Baptist Church is a man named Homer Lindsay Sr. Dr. Lindsay Sr. came from Avondale Baptist Church in Chattanooga, Tennessee, in the midst of its crushing financial difficulties at the end of the 1930s. He said that the Holy Spirit led him to Jacksonville because he so wanted to help this struggling church. And there are 3 reforms. The first that Dr. Lindsay brought was the one of financial responsibility. Dr. Lindsay understood the future was at stake, that a broke church can't preach the gospel. He understood that a church that can't pay its bills cannot reach new people for Jesus. He created a campaign that he called Debt Free in 43, and there were 2 parts to it. The first was his preaching, teaching, training, and equipping to lead the people of First Baptist Church to tithe. This was a huge emphasis in the ministry of Dr. Lindsay. Still today, we have senior adults in our congregation who tithe because of what they learned about the discipline back in the 1940s. A second prong of Debt Free in 43 was very disciplined spending. Dr. Lindsay was absolutely committed to not overspending the budget. He was ruthless in monitoring expenses. One illustration has to do with pencils. And in fact, there's a picture around here someplace that I'll show to people, and it's a picture. Have you seen the picture of that little tiny pencil sharpened down to the nub?
Yes.
And he would not, your granddad, he would not let you get a pencil.
You would have to turn in your pencil.
Without turning it and sharpened down to the metal nub that was attached to the eraser. Back then, the staff at First Baptist Church were issued pencils to do their work, and Dr. Lindsay's rule was you get 1 pencil. And you may not get a replacement until you turn that pencil in after it has been sharpened all the way down to the metal nub that connects it to the eraser. He was going to make sure we were going to get every last centimeter out of the wood in those pencils. Between encouragement to giving generously and to tithing and watching expenses, the plan worked. You need to understand, the plan was nearly insane. The plan required First Baptist Church, the most indebted church in America, to pay off all of its debt in just 3 years. And it wasn't just any 3 years. This is the early 1940s. The world is at war.
Ladies and gentlemen, we may be approaching a fateful hour. All night long, bulletins have been pouring in from Berlin claiming that D-Day is here, claiming that the invasion of Western Europe has begun.
The men and women who were paying down the debt were buying their groceries with war rationing coupons. But the nearly insane plan worked, and the debt was cleared on December of 1943. It was a remarkable reform. And it paved the way for all of the great things that came in the decades to follow. There was another characteristic of Dr. Lindsay's reform, and it was pastoral care. I want to be very clear to say this because a lot of times people think about reformers as these hard, heavy-handed people who come in with a bulldozer and they bang heads together and they're really harsh. That's not the kind of reformer that Dr. Lindsay was. People still talk today about how kind and gentle and gracious a man he was. Let's start with Lindsay Sr. Tell me what he was like as a man.
Well, as I said, a tender-hearted man full of the gospel, but he could preach.
Okay.
And he would preach. One of his favorite sermons is "The Iron Did Swim." Mm-hmm. You've probably heard that.
Yeah.
And he would preach that around time of start giving money, the miracles that God did, and iron did swim. And
yeah.
He would preach it. Just a good preacher, easy to listen to. And you just wanted to be closer to the Lord just because of him.
I hear today from people who would be invited over to his home to have homemade ice cream. I hear today about people who remember the touch of his hand on theirs and his gentle prayers over them as they were sick. One of the things that people talk about the most is the way he ended every service on Sunday evening. It was an opportunity for him to share his heart with the whole congregation, and it came to be called the End of the Perfect Day speech that he gave every week at First Baptist. You can hear, as you listen to it, the heart of a pastor for his flock.
Now, once again, we have come to the end of a perfect day in God's house. For 32 years, the Lord has let me have as my flock the most gracious, loving people on the face of this earth. We have come a long, long way together. We have worked, wept, and have rejoiced together. I have welcomed your little ones into this big, wide world, have watched them mature, and have officiated at the marriage altar. I have journeyed with you as you laid your loved ones away in the last resting place of the body, and sought to comfort you in your hour of need. We have laughed together, wept together, and rejoiced together. You have become my family that I love better than any people on the face of this earth. We have truly been workers together with God. 28 years of steady, consistent growth in every area of our church life and work. Yes, once again, we come to the end of a perfect day in God's house.
If your legacy is that you righted a listing financial ship, restored care and love to the pastoral office, that's more than enough legacy. The most significant reform that Dr. Lindsay Sr. brought was his successor, his son, Homer Lindsay Jr. I said earlier that I was going to talk to you about two builders in the history of First Baptist Church. One was W.A. Hobson. Well, now we're at the second one, and his name is Dr. Homer Lindsay Jr.
When Jacob was a young man, he was running from Esau, and he stopped at a place, and he made a pillow out of some rocks. He went to sleep, and he had a dream.
Dr. Lindsay Jr. was born in Nashville, Tennessee on July 10th, 1927. He was the firstborn son of his parents, and he moved to Florida with them in 1940. Dr. Lindsay had graduated from Southwestern Seminary in 1952, and he ultimately earned a D.Min from Luther Rice Seminary. He met and married a girl from Lake Wales, Florida, named Shirley Tillman, and they had 4 kids, Nancy Ann, Clara Ruth, Peggy Sue, and Homer Gentry. Dr. Lindsay pastored 2 churches. The first was Northwest Baptist Church in Miami, Florida in 1952. When he arrived at that church, there were 42 people in the church. Under his leadership, that church would swell to 3,280 people in just 16 years. Regularly, that church would lead the Southern Baptist Convention in baptisms. It was a remarkable ministry, but it is not the ministry where Dr. Lindsay would stay. His father was still pastoring back in Jacksonville, Florida at First Baptist, and Dr. Lindsay Sr. knew he was slowing down. He knew he needed to start moving towards retirement, and so he went to the deacons and he asked for a pulpit committee to find his replacement. He said he wasn't going to be in a hurry to leave. He said he was going to be sure there was a steady and a stable transition. He wanted to give them time to find the right person, and he would wait until they did. Well, the search committee came back with 2 shocking propositions. The first is, we think the person who should succeed you is your son. And the second is, we think that instead of a simple succession plan, what we should have is a co-pastor arrangement where you would both serve together as pastors until you're ready to retire. Father and son talked about it. They prayed about it. They agreed the plan could work. The church loved the idea. And on January 1st, 1969, Homer Lindsay Jr. became the co-pastor of First Baptist Church, serving alongside his very own father, Homer Lindsay Sr.
So in 69, Lindsay Sr. brings Lindsay Jr. as a co-pastor. You were a little guy, teenager.
13.
What did you think about that?
The interesting thing was that when Dr. Lindsay Jr. came, one of his priorities was with the youth. And we kind of thought his ideas were a little bit crazy. And we were initially not very excited about it, to be honest.
Like what would be an example of something that was crazy?
Well, the thought that he was going to take young people on Saturdays and have them go door to door visiting, doing a religious survey to get prospects for the church.
Okay.
Wasn't how I wanted to spend my Saturdays, and I kind of thought that it would not last very long, but made it through. Both of my two oldest sons took part in that activity.
Didn't seem any different other than we had two pastors, and Dr. Lindsay presented things in one way and Dr. Lindsay Jr. in another way. And they were entirely different people, but both of them had a message and made you feel at home.
The church could not have known in 1968 and in 1969 that when they made that decision to bring Homer Lindsay Jr. as pastor, they were making the single most consequential leadership decision that had ever been made in the history of First Baptist Church. They had chosen at that moment to bring in the man who would stand head and shoulders above every other pastor in 184 years in terms of his influence and faithfulness. A pastor's legacy is always bigger than numbers. In fact, it's dangerous to boil a pastor's legacy down to numbers. But numbers do help us get a sense of the size and scope of what Dr. Lindsay accomplished. In 1969, when Dr. Lindsay Jr. became pastor, First Baptist Church had 3,620 members. In 1999, just 1 year before his pastoral ministry ended, the church had 26,088 members. In 1969, when he became pastor, the church budget was right under $400,000. In 1999, the year before his ministry ended, it was in the tens of millions. In 1969, the property value of First Baptist Church was $2.9 million. In 1999, First Baptist was doing ministry on land valued at over $60 million. But you can't hear these numbers and not be overwhelmed that God was doing something amazing. And the question is, what is that amazing thing? First of all, Dr. Lindsay was a builder with a heart for Jesus Christ. In a kingdom where the Holy Spirit loves to give his power to exalt and lift up the name of Jesus, we should not be surprised that a man who is in love with Jesus would be anointed with much spiritual power to do much great work. I interviewed dozens of people for this podcast. The person I interviewed outside of the Lindsay family that had the closest relationship with Dr. Lindsay himself was Bob Barton, who serves today as a faithful pastor at a church here in Jacksonville, but was a long-serving pastor at First Baptist during the Lindsay years. Dr. Lindsay personally discipled Bob, and the two of them had a deep love for one another. Here is what Bob had to say about Dr. Lindsay's passion and love for Jesus. I was in Southern Baptist life. And out in the Southern Baptist Convention, mostly when people talked about First Jacksonville, they talked about Jerry Vines. He was the president. People knew about Homer Lindsay, but Dr. Vines was the forward-facing one in terms of the convention. But it was very clear after 2 months, the only name we heard was Homer Lindsay. That was it, from everybody. Nobody had a favorite. They promoted one another, but Homer is the one on everybody's lips. Why?
Heart. He deeply loved Jesus Christ. He taught this church 3 things, and then he added a 4th. Love Jesus, love each other, love the lost. And to do this, Dr. Lindsay would say, I had to teach them how to be thankful. So these were recurring themes. So when you think about what was the stuff, the juice that made First Baptist what it was, or perhaps what it is today, what it should be, and I think probably the most enduring legacy any church could ever have would be love for Christ and love for others and love for the lost. That permeated Lindsay's worldview. He was so transparent. He was so self-deprecating in his humor and his stories. He let us into his heart, you know. I mean, you felt like you knew him. You would think, oh, man, if God can use him, I'm sure he can use me. I got to work with him for 16 years, and he was my pastor since I was 13. He was one in a million.
Dr. Lindsay also was a builder with a strategy for evangelism. Dr. Lindsay didn't just want to reach lost people. Dr. Lindsay had a plan to reach lost people with a visitation program that was the envy of the entire Southern Baptist Convention. The visitation program at First Baptist began on Saturdays with hundreds of youth group members going out on buses into neighborhoods and doing door-to-door religious surveys about who would be interested in a visit, who would be interested in ministry. The visitation program continued on Sundays as First Baptist kept very careful records about visitors who came to attend the church. And then the culmination of the visitation program was on Tuesdays as hundreds of members would fan out across the city, following up on the contacts from the religious surveys, following up on the visitors from Sunday, and sharing the gospel with men and women and boys and girls in hundreds of living rooms all across the city. It was a door-to-door evangelism strategy that was remarkably successful and literally led to tens of thousands of baptisms at First Baptist Church. Margaret Tucker was 1 year old when she came to First Baptist Church. She's grown up at this church and is currently on the ministry staff. She was crucially involved in the door-to-door evangelism ministry as a student, and here's how she described what that was like.
The Lindsay years are 1940 to 2000, and so when Lindsay dies, he's not just ending a co-pastor arrangement with Vines, but in a larger perspective, it's the end of 60 years of a Lindsay being a pastor at First Baptist. And the amazing thing about it is, with just a few exceptions, all of those 60 years were growth. And many of those 60 years were overwhelmingly dramatic growth. What do you think worked?
Culturally, what was happening, the fight for the family. In the 80s, it was marriage and divorce. And I think that was what was taught from the pulpit. I think it was attractive for most to hear that. I remember people asking me the question when I used to do pastors' conference classes, how is your church this big? And I'm like, well, I don't think it got this big from doing the wrong thing. I think there was a pull. I would love to say it's from the pulpit. I think was part of that. I think Dr. Vines was a phenomenal orator, teacher. I think, though, why we grew and kept the people we kept, I think happened through Sunday school. I'm a Sunday school girl, and that's all I've ever known. I'm sure my dad and maybe even Tyler brought up Guy Freeman, and that was a Dr. Lindsay Jr. He gave her the vision of that, and she took it and ran with it. I think Sunday school is where you felt loved on, where the massive church became your church. It's where ownership happens. I don't know if it led to the massive growth of what we saw happening during the church service times, but I think it's what maintained the group and kept the people. If a visitor visited, even in that auditorium, if a visitor filled out a card, if we got their information, and they were visited the very next week. And I know you can't do that nowadays. I remember feeling this as a teenager. They're making us do the dirty work. It's hot out here and they put us on these buses and they would say, it's because you love Jesus. And I'm like, it's because ain't nobody else want to be out here on those buses. And they drop us off everywhere, all across town. There was not a place you didn't go. They would drop us off in a big group, and then we would look at our little map and know what street. And we would say, we'd love to ask you a few questions. That's how we got prospects. And I would say 250, 300, easy, would come on those Saturdays because you were working for a ski trip. and for Jesus.
Dr. Lindsay was also a builder with a passion for fiscal responsibility. He took after his father in this regard. He encouraged generosity. He watched expenses like a hawk. He never overspent the church budget because he knew those funds were what would fuel the ministry underneath the grace of God. Steve Clifton has been at First Baptist Church since 1996. He's been in various roles in that time, but he's currently serving very faithfully today in our pastoral care area. And he remembered a fascinating story in a meeting about Dr. Lindsay's careful watching over financial expenditures. Here's a fascinating story Steve told about letters in the mailroom.
Dr. Lindsay was a very kind man. I loved serving for Dr. Lindsay. You remind me very much of him in many ways. He was very godly. He was very forthright. He was a strong leader. One day in our staff meeting, someone had written a letter and mailed it out to the entire youth or some group. I don't know exactly which group it was. And he had gotten in the mailroom and seen these letters stacked up from this staff member and brought them in with him to the staff meeting. And he said, "Now, all this stack of letters was prepared by one of you to be sent out, and I caught them in the mailroom. And you did not write an article to post in the Evangel or the Lighthouse, whichever, I can't remember. There was 2 publications each week. I don't remember which one it was. But the one that was mailed out to the home had more writings in it. And you did not write an article, and you're wasting," and he knew how much money that was going to cost to send that out. I don't know, $3 or $4, but whatever it was. He said, "We're not going to do that. If you cannot write an article and put it in the Evangel or the Lighthouse, then we're not going to spend the money to send this letter out."
Dr. Lindsay was also a builder that was devoted to his church. In a Christian culture where it's popular for many preachers and teachers to use their church as a platform to launch a larger preaching ministry. There's nothing wrong with traveling to other churches to preach, expanding influence in the ministry world, but that is not the kind of influence that Dr. Lindsay sought. Dr. Lindsay was committed to First Baptist Church, and he hardly ever left. People followed him in this. They saw his devotion and his delight in his congregation, and they responded with similar devotion and with similar delight. Dr. Lindsay was also committed to biblical, practical, verse-by-verse preaching. One of the things that you hear when you talk to people who knew Dr. Lindsay is that he was an introvert who found it difficult to have personal conversations. But he was an introvert who came alive when it was time to preach the Bible. John Blunt grew up at First Baptist Church. He's been affiliated with this church for over 50 years. He eventually served as a staff member and currently is a pastor at our church. He experienced the fruit of Dr. Lindsay's ministry and knew him personally. And here's what he had to say about his personality and preaching style.
Lindsay Jr. was an evangelist. He was a soul winner. He was focused on expository preaching. His father was too, but his father was probably a little more topical. He was still expository, but Lindsay Jr. brought book by book, verse by verse expository preaching, and it was wonderful. Dr. Lindsay Sr. was a statesman, very polished, but not aloof, not arrogant. None of that came off of him as his personality. He was very approachable. And Dr. Lindsay Jr. was a self-declared introvert. He had a hard time talking with anyone face-to-face outside of the pulpit. But when he's in the pulpit, he's a different man. The boldness of the Spirit upon him, fearless, courageous, preached with fabulous conviction, not nearly as polished from an oratory standpoint, but utterly rooted in the Word and full of passion. And his great desire was to help us love Jesus Christ with a real passion. He wanted us to know and love Jesus Christ. He wanted this church to be thankful and to be sharing the gospel constantly.
Dr. Lindsay loved to preach the Bible verse by verse, and it was that love for the Bible and its authority that led him to bring Jerry Vines here to assist him in the work of pastoral ministry, and the two would wind up serving together for 18 years as co-pastors. There's another element of the Lindsay legacy, the glorious music ministry. People at First Baptist loved their pastor. They loved preaching. They also loved the music. In the glorious heyday of music at First Baptist is characterized by glorious choirs, glorious orchestras, the most famous names in Christian music, from Sandy Patty to the Cathedrals, from Gaither Homecomings to the Hoppers, the Brooklyn Tabernacle Choir, all under the leadership of people like R.O. Stone, Rodney Brooks, Camp Kirkland, and Jim Whitmire. To this very day, at First Baptist Church, we continue to have a remarkable music ministry that is presided over by our pastor of music and worship, Dr. Scott Cannell. And here is what he had to say about the music ministry back in the glory days at First Baptist.
It's a significant church with a significant responsibility. I don't know who that would be, but I will pray about who that might be and try to give you a name. And then you said, well, what about you? And I think I laughed out loud. I recall that anyway, at least in my mind. I laughed at that because I thought it was preposterous that I could be the guy who would lead the worship ministry at First Baptist. Everyone knows about the music ministry at First Baptist. And so with that come high expectations, great expectations, and certainly a significant amount of pressure to live up to a standard that's been set by some incredibly gifted men who've preceded me.
What did you know about First Baptist? You're a seminary professor at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. You got your training at Southwestern, some other training at Southern, but what did you know about First Baptist Church Jacksonville?
Nothing firsthand because I'd never been here, but by reputation, by recordings, by name recognition, it was even more lofty because there was this understanding that some of the greatest practitioners in church music had either been on staff here or had come through here for one reason or another. Camp Kirkland would have been one of the biggest names that came out of First Baptist, and I, as a high school trombone player sitting in my church orchestra, would more often than not on my music stand would have his name because we're playing another piece written by Camp Kirkland. And so you just knew that this was a trendsetter and a standard bearer for using instruments in the church. Some of the great worship and music leaders in the history of the convention have been here. The two names that most people would recognize would be Rodney Brooks and Jim Whitmire. Jim Whitmire is kind of the dean of ministers of music in the Southern Baptist Convention. He's led at Bellevue, on staff, Bellevue, First Dallas, and First Jacksonville. Well, those are three of the most significant churches in the history of the convention, and he's been the minister of music at each of those places. You just recognize when you're being considered for a position that's been held by people like that, you are in over your head just by default. I'm not those men.
All of these different elements of the Lindsay legacy came together through the 80s and the 90s to make First Baptist Jacksonville the largest church in the city, in the state of Florida, and one of the largest churches in America. It could only be attributed to the grace of God. It was so amazing. People at First Baptist call what happened in those years the miracle of downtown Jacksonville. I introduced you to Bob Barton earlier. One of the questions I asked everybody I interviewed who was here during the Lindsay years is what worked? What made the Lindsay years so effective? It was so big. It was so influential. What worked? And the person who gave my favorite answer to that question was Bob. And here is his very insightful answer. I'm thinking about a pastor in Milwaukee I'm thinking about a pastor in Columbia, South Carolina. I'm thinking about guys who love Jesus. They're giving their life to the Lord. They're making $18,000 a year because they want to see the Lord do a thing. They want to see the Lord save lost people. And not all those people are going to see 1,000 people baptized in a year, or 600 or 300 or 200 or 50. So it seems like the Lord decided to do an amazing thing here. There's something happened that was unique, and I want to know what that was.
The power of God. So Lindsay told us one time, he said every service I would go into that little room next to the pulpit, and I would sit there and I would ask the Holy Spirit to fill me with power. And he said 2 times I went to the pulpit and I thought, he's not going to fill me, but he did. And we believed him because it was on display, because you can't explain this place on Lindsay's genius or pulpit ability. He just had the power of God on him. I'm just telling you, he just did.
Now, I promised you 6 kinds of leaders and have given you 4. I'm going to tell you 2 more very quickly. Another kind of leader is a maintainer. A maintainer is somebody who extends a previous season of ministry. Think of the ministry of the prophet Elisha. He joins up with Elijah, and the prayer is that he would just have some of Elijah's spirit. Sometimes ministries need stability and care. Maintainers are called to do that work, to lead with faithfulness in the absence of dramatic decline or explosive growth. And then a final kind of leader that we can talk about is a failure. Think of King Saul. This is someone who does serious damage to ministry. An obsession with power, with pride, with prestige, with money, with women, leads the heart of a failure leader away from Christ, from the church, and from faithfulness, and everything he touches breaks. You don't need me to demonstrate who these people are. It seems like every month in our world today, we're hearing about the fall of another pastor, and all we can do is pray that we would not be one of them. A leader who is a failure will break everything he touches. So I've promised I'm not just going to tell you stories about what happened at First Baptist, but we're going to learn lessons each week. And this week we're learning lessons about leadership. There's a few other things I want you to think about regarding leadership before we're done on this episode. Here's the first. Leadership is indispensable. We live in a world where leadership has fallen on hard times. People distrust leaders. People are wary of leaders. But here's the fact. God has simply chosen that when he does ministry, he will do it through a leader. So we can never throw leaders out. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 17 says, "Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls." If you want to be a part of a thriving ministry, you need to find the leader that God has raised up. You need to pray for him. You need to get behind him. It's the only way your ministry is going to be blessed. As we were going through the transition at First Baptist Church, we got connected with the ministry of Bob Russell. Many of you will know Bob Russell as the former pastor at Southeast Christian Church that he pastored for over 40 years. When he became pastor in the 1960s, they had 120 people. When he retired 40 years later, they had 18,000 people. And he is a man of wisdom and of grace, and he helped us in our times of difficulty here at First Baptist. And I asked him, what do you think led to such dramatic success in your ministry? How do you go from 120 to 18,000? What was it? And here's what he said. So 120 people to 18,000 people over the course of your ministry. It's not just, for me, the remarkable ministry that you've had, but the remarkable man that you are. What I love about the ministry that you had there is that you are a faithful man. You love Jesus, you love the Bible, you preached the Word. Tell me about the focus of your ministry while you were there. How did the Lord do this great work?
You know, I wrote a book about the history of Southeast, and it was entitled When God Builds a Church, because we felt like that what happened was so much of God that it was something that people on their own couldn't do, and certainly somebody as ill-equipped as I could do. And the book did fairly well. The first thing in that book that I wrote was preaching the practical sermons that are biblically based. And I think that was the first step in God honoring our church, that when the Bible says God's word doesn't return empty, that was true for us. And we had outstanding lay leaders too. And that's a quality, a characteristic that is missing in so many churches and so many preachers that I talk to. They have a dysfunctional leadership. But you have unity at the core, and you have quality people at the core who are like Aaron and Hur holding up the preacher's hands. You can do a lot. It's when you have dysfunction at the core that becomes really difficult.
A ministry that gets behind a good and a faithful leader will be blessed. A ministry that undermines leadership will decline. Here's another leadership lesson. When God raises up a leader, He is going to require hard, unpleasant, and unexpected work from that leader. I've been in ministry for my adult life. I've spent 10 years of that ministry teaching future pastors in seminary. And one of the things I've learned over the years is that there is a romantic notion that many people have about pastoral ministry. A lot of people, when they think about being a pastor, they think about studying the Bible and reading their books and being closed off in their study, and they show up on Sunday morning to preach these wonderful sermons, and ministry just works and is wonderful. And that vision is not real. Now, of course, preaching is central. That centrality of preaching requires careful study and rigorous effort. Faithfulness in pastoral ministry will never demand less than faithful preparation and delivery of sermons, but it also will require more. The founder of First Baptist Church, James McDonald, was so devoted to preaching that he worked hard to get a core group of people and build a building so they could hear the word be preached. W.A. Hobson was so devoted to preaching that he stopped preaching for a year to travel all over the country to raise money so people could have a place to hear the word be preached. Homer Lindsay Jr. was so devoted to preaching that he made a lot of cuts and a lot of enemies so that the church could afford to fund a preaching ministry. And Lindsay Jr. was devoted to preaching, and he spent decades building a massive infrastructure, parking garages and buildings and all sorts of things so that thousands of families could come and hear the word be preached. The fact is that many pastors fail in their ministry because they are lazy. They baptize their laziness in pious-sounding language about I need to study the text and I need to be busy in the Word. And absolutely, you need to be busy in the text and you need to be busy in the Word. But our commitment to ministry won't count for much if we neglect practical matters and we are left with nobody to preach to. Leaders must figure out how they fit in the church's historical moment. Every leader has to ask and answer two very hard questions. What is required in this moment of our history for our ministry to succeed? Here's the second question, and it's harder than the first one. Do I have what it takes to lead this ministry through this season? This places a burden on the leader to identify the historical moment and the challenges that they are facing, and then to come up with a path to move forward so that there is hope and a future for that ministry. It's one thing to look honestly at your ministry. It's another thing to look honestly at yourself. I've shared some of the various kinds of leaders to help you think this through. Whatever you are, you got to figure it out. Our ministries will not succeed if we don't figure out the moment we are in and the kind of leader we are. And so we need to pray, we need to seek wisdom, and we need to listen to that wisdom. Here's the last lesson for this week, and it's really encouraging. God is still doing great things to expand his kingdom. All of us are doing ministry in really discouraging times. It feels like a season of loss instead of gain. It feels like a season of decline instead of growth. It seems like our message is harder to hear by the people we're preaching to than it's ever been before. If you're like me, you want to see this change. You want to see a wind of revival come over our churches and our cities and our country and our world. I read the accounts in Scripture of the great works of God, and it makes my heart want to burst because I want to see these great works of God with my own eyes. I hear about the great things the Lord has done at the church I pastor in the past. I hear about the great things the Lord has done at churches all across this country in the past, and I yearn to see it with my own eyes. And here's the encouragement, that God is still doing great things. You see it at First Baptist, at a church that's 184 years old. Through civil wars and world wars and depressions and great fires, God built and is building a great church. You see this in the promise and the power of God. God is never going to stop doing great things because God is never going to stop honoring Jesus. And so we have to approach our work with enthusiasm and an expectation that the power of God is going to show up. And who knows, as you sit there as a leader, you may be the very one that God is raising up to do the next great thing in your church, and in small and subtle ways, those great things may already have begun. None of that means there won't be hard times in our ministries. The story I've told you so far gets you through the glory days of First Baptist Church. But the glory days at First Baptist didn't last. The glory days never last at your church. They never last anywhere. The glory days at First Baptist were the Lindsay years. And when they came to an end, that meant that the hardest years in the life of the church were still ahead. I'm going to talk to you about that next time. But before we get there, let's listen to some more glorious music from some of the glory years at First Baptist Church.